In January 1963, Great Britain was shrouded in snow. The railways were battling for survival after unprecedented falls in their revenue and were under investigation by their own chairman. Would they be able to dig their way out and climb back to prosperity, both metaphorically and physically? 18 months earlier, a new chairman had been appointed to oversee British Railways, a successor to Sir Brian Robertson, who had presided over the national concern since 1953, a period during which it had gone from profit to loss and from an old-fashioned steam railway to something that was neither old or new-fashioned. The railways were sick indeed, and the new chairman was a doctor, Dr. Richard Beeching, and he was charged with curing British Railways and taking it out of the doldrums and to bring it back to health. Dr. Beeching wasn't a medical doctor, but a doctor of physics, and had made his name as technical director of the country's biggest chemicals company, ICI. He had spent those 18 months making a detailed investigation into all aspects of the railways and was due to announce his findings in March 1963. In January of that year, the weather had succeeded in doing what Dr. Beeching would shortly try to do: shut down much of the railway network of the country. The railwaymen knew how to fight back against the weather and turned out in force to dig the trains out of trouble. These scenes took place in Scotland, but, as we'll see, the snows covered the entire country down to the south coast. As the road transport of the country, known to be the Conservative government's preferred form of transport, ground to a halt, the railwaymen performed Herculean tasks to get their services running again. The newsreels recorded it all in black and white, just like the countryside, and how Dr. Beeching would spell out his findings.
Scotland's been suffering its worst blizzard for 10 years. So heavy was the snowfall that 4 trains were held up. Here's one on the Perth-Aberdeen line being dug out when we flew over. Over 30 main roads have been blocked and traffic, of course, very seriously disrupted. Impossible in many places to get supplies through to isolated farms and villages. 6 deaths due to the blizzard are reported. Where roads are not snowbound, icy surfaces have made driving an absolute menace. As well as Scotland, large areas of the north of England were also badly affected. And here's you-know-who doing you-know-what.
The Met Office reported that this was the coldest winter over England and Wales since 1740, and none colder has been recorded since. 1947 was the closest to it, and as in 1947, anticyclones to the north and east of the British Isles brought bitterly cold winds from the east day after day. Also like 1947, depressions followed tracks to southward of the British Isles, and their fronts brought snow to England, Wales and the southernmost parts of Scotland. The average maximum temperatures for January 1963 were more than 5 degrees centigrade below the seasonal average over most of Wales, the Midlands and southern England, and in some places more than 7 degrees below average. The story was much the same in February. Winter had begun suddenly, just before Christmas 1962, following a long period of stormy weather since the beginning of the month. The belt of rain over northern Scotland on Christmas Eve turned to snow as it moved south, giving Glasgow its first white Christmas since 1938. The snow belt reached southern England on Boxing Day and became almost stationary. The following day, a foot of snow blanketed most of southern England. Blizzards over the southwest of England and South Wales on the 29th and 30th of December brought snowdrifts 20 feet deep. Villages were cut off, some for several days. Roads and railways were blocked, telephone wires were brought down, stocks of food ran low. Farmers couldn't reach their livestock, thousands of sheep, ponies and cattle starved to death. Nothing moved. The railways were the first to get moving once again and proved to be a lifeline, especially to people in rural or remote areas. People who had for years turned their backs on the railways turned to them once again in their hour of need. Only the trains could provide them with essentials, and only by train could they move around the land. January saw snowfalls throughout the country, and more heavy snow fell in early February. In the southwest of Scotland, a Stranraer passenger service became trapped in heavy drifts at Bar Hill. A helicopter was used to rescue some passengers, whilst others were rescued by a team from Girvan. This line reopened on the 10th of February, but was closed again on the 13th after more blizzards. Air to Stranraer services were rerouted via Kilmarnock and Dumfries, the direct route not being available for another week. In England, the Settle and Carlisle route was blocked from Dent to the summit at Ace Gill and wasn't reopened until February the 23rd, when 5 trains were trapped in Devon as the blizzard of February the 5th moved south. Southern electric services were disrupted by ice on the conductor or third rails. Points would freeze over and locomotives would run through the night hours in an attempt to prevent this. The cold weather played havoc with the new diesels. If they avoided damage to their power units and cooling system, they were usually deployed on freight work as their sensitive train heating boilers would freeze. Steam locomotives which had already been withdrawn were, if possible, reinstated, even when in poor condition. The problems resulting from the snow were compounded by the length of time it was there and the sheer amount of it. Some steam locomotives had to be brought in from far afield, examples being locomotives from Manchester, Carlisle and Shrewsbury being sent south to run the commuter services from Euston to Watford, Tring and Northampton. But even steam locomotives weren't entirely free from problems associated with the cold. Water supplies would freeze, coal could freeze into well-nigh solid heaps, and supplies from the mines were restricted. The countryside scene here is that of the southern part of England, and we are travelling on a Western Region train from the west to London. As can be seen, the snow was evenly spread along the route, and by this time, mid-February, the railway had been reasonably well cleared and was able to function normally. However, as in 1947, so it was in this winter. Brief thaws occurred from time to time, and winter didn't fully relax its grip before early March. During that time, whilst road traffic would only venture out once the black ice and frozen roads had been gritted, the railway's main concern was frozen points and signalling. The Met Office records that in the last few days of February and the first few days of March 1963, sunny weather brought afternoon temperatures of 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, but clear skies allowed temperatures to plummet at night. Frosts were moderate or severe. At last, on the 4th of March, a mild southwesterly flow of air reached the British Isles. There was occasional rain that day in most parts of Britain, and further rain the following day in the west and north, this time prolonged. On the 6th of March there was no frost anywhere in the British Isles, and the temperature in London reached 17 degrees centigrade, the highest since the 25th of October 1962. The coldest winter over England and Wales since 1740 and the coldest over Scotland since 1879 had ended. With the thaw came flooding, but nothing like the scale of the 1947 floods. Soon after the winter of 1962-3, life returned to normal. But not for the railways. It was well known that Dr. Beeching, appointed chairman of BR in June 1961, had been gathering data which boded ill for the future. His report was due later that same month, and leaks indicated that it would be devastating. But first, he had a date with the Queen.
Mr. Marples, Minister of Transport, presents Dr. Beeching and his deputy, Sir Philip Water, to the Queen. Her Majesty, visiting the eastern region of British Railways, went from Liverpool Street Station to Stratford. First stop was to look at diesel engines at the maintenance depot. Then to the control tower at the Temple Mills marshalling yard. She watched typical operations in progress, including wagon retarders at work. Many other aspects of railway work that seldom come to public notice were on the programme of the Queen's visit. During it, she accepted a model engine. It should amuse the Prince of Wales over his convalescence.
Dr. Beeching had spent 18 months examining all aspects of British Railways operations and was to publish his findings on March the 27th, 1963. They did indeed make devastating reading for supporters of the railways. We have to apologise for the quality of the next piece, a television news report, and as for its contents...
Highlands will lose their services. North of Aberdeen, very few will be left. Little more than the main north-south links will remain. Many of the country services are doomed. West country share the fate of many market towns. No station, no passenger trains. Lose money. Many of them carry less than a single bus could do. A good deal of the total saving of about 100 million a year will come here. Neither commuters nor holidaymakers pay their way either. In London they almost do, but nowhere else. Higher fares are clearly threatened. Despite modernisation, the parcel services don't pay either. But the lessons have been learnt. Proper handling and faster trains are the new style. Over now to something that does pay, coal. Indeed, on running costs, it pays nearly 25 millions a year, and the railways hope to improve on this by running through trains. The old goods wagon is out of date, slow, cumbersome, unprofitable. There are too many depots. 900 will be cut to about 100 main ones. Big through trains taking boxcars from road vehicles will speed the traffic and cut the pilfering. The new device will be the liner train, so-called, a goods train running on a timetable, carrying special containers with rapid handling at both ends of the journey. It may cost 100 millions to put the system in. The present annual loss of 140 millions a year will not be wiped out, but by 1970, most of it should be gone.
The railwaymen themselves are now faced with this prospect of another 70,000 jobs being lost to this industry. Do you believe that they'll go along with you in this plan?
I think they can. I don't think that they will put their heads in the sand and keep them there. I think that these proposals are in the long-term interests of railwaymen. I think they'll go along with us, but it does present them with a very great difficulty.
Unsurprisingly, the findings of the Reshaping of British Railways report were generally accepted by the government. Summing it up, the closure of 2,300 stations and 800 freight depots was envisaged. Passenger services would be withdrawn from 266 lines and 71 others modified. Within 3 years, the coaching stock would be reduced by 15,000 vehicles and wagons by 350,000. However, the current stock of 1,700 mainline diesels would be increased to about 4,000, but steam, already being phased out rapidly, would go even quicker than before, as the closures would make the overall requirement for locomotives far less. However, the British public, despite having been warned and despite their apparent disregard of the railways, were soon up in arms. Suddenly, people who hadn't used a train for years were forming committees to save their local lines, everyone now seeming to be a special case. But deserted trains, even when modern diesel railcars had been put in charge, told their own stories, and most of Dr. Beeching's findings were irrefutable. The first closures, after a suitable public hearing in front of Transport Users Consultative Committees, were upheld, and closures started in 1964. Some lines which were to be retained were drastically pruned. Double-track main lines, in particular the Southern's West of England main line, would be reduced to just a single line of rails, with many wayside stations closed completely. There were a few notable exceptions. If Beeching was to have his way, all trains and railways in the north and west of Scotland would go. The scenic road to the Isles via Fort William and Malade was one such route. It had never been profitable, and the government at the end of the 19th century had been compelled to give guarantees and support to the North British Railway, as it was considered to be of the utmost importance that the West Highlands be opened up due to the poverty of the region. This time the railway was saved by the announcement that a new factory was to be opened at Corpac near Fort William by Scottish Pulp Developments Limited in 1964, and British Railways guaranteed to maintain it for 22 years so it could service the pulp mills. The pulp mill actually only lasted until 1981, but its very existence saved the railway. The timber traffic on the West Highland was an example of the type of freight traffic which was well suited to the railway, and this became a very efficient self-contained operation. Lest it be thought that the Beeching report, as the Reshaping of British Railways was popularly known, was entirely negative, it should be pointed out that it had many positive aspects as well. What Beeching said was that the railway should only carry the kind of traffic for which it was most suitable, and that underused or redundant assets should be disposed of. The latter included the lines and stations to be closed, but the kind of traffic for which it was most suitable should not only be kept but developed. This included much freight, particularly dedicated bulk flows such as the timber traffic seen here. Environmental considerations were a thing of the future. Modern handling methods would reduce the dependence on the railway's real bête noire, staff. Investment in machinery would cut staff numbers and improve efficiency. Investment in new freight rolling stock, dedicated to its role, bigger and able to travel at higher speeds, would cut transit times and make the railways more competitive with road transport. What would go were the old-fashioned small wagons which still made up the bulk of British Railways' wagon fleet, together with the numerous local goods yards that accompanied almost every station. As a side effect of this, the land vacated by the goods yards could be profitably converted to car parking to accommodate motorists who would thus be encouraged to drive to the station to take the train for the bulk of the journey. Critics said that the report failed to take account of the feeder nature of branch line railways, which produced the revenue for the main lines. But Beeching foresaw that the car could be harnessed to the advantage of the railways in this way, whilst divesting them of expensive branches which still cost the railways money in real terms. However, experience showed that once in a car, a driver would use it for the full journey, so the railways lost out altogether. Beeching also expected local bus services, which would be set up to replace local and branch rail services, to become integrated with the railway. But this never happened, and many bus-to-station services were soon withdrawn, leaving large parts of the country with no public transport at all. The railway's own internal traffic would continue, but the maintenance of tracks would be streamlined. Again, new methods of working and the investment in modern mechanical equipment would take priority, as this was another way of reducing the dependence on staff. One particular development which was to be accelerated was the relaying of track with what were known as long welded rails, which have since become the modern form of permanent way. The long rails both improve the standard of comfort for the passenger, reduce the maintenance of the track itself, and spread the load, allowing heavier vehicles on the track and thus further increasing efficiency. There was a considerable amount of the report devoted to what kinds of rail freight traffic should be developed. Much had already been done to improve this under the modernisation plan, even though it had taken a number of wrong turns along the way. The worst was the construction of vast marshalling yards, some of which were still being completed at the time the Beeching report was published. This effectively made them obsolete before they were even ready for use, as it advocated the elimination of the kinds of traffic which required marshalling, and the promotion of bulk traffic such as this cement train, which would go from loading point to terminal without a break in its journey. Another cost reduction which the new wagons would eventually allow was the elimination of the traditional guards van at the tail of every freight train. Historically, these had been known as brake vans, as that was their purpose when freight trains consisted of unbraked wagons, and the guard was a vital part of the team in keeping a train under control. With the advent of modern continuously braked wagons, the guard became as redundant as the fireman in the cab of a locomotive. All these proposals were understood by the Conservative government, which was looking primarily at ways to save money. In 1960 the losses had amounted to £68 million, in 1961 £87 million, and in 1962 £104 million, the latter equivalent to more than £1 billion at today's prices. Beeching expected the costs to rise briefly, whilst his so-called axe was swung, but that the railway would thus be steered back to profit, or at least to stop losing money. By contrast, the motor industry was expanding rapidly during this time, and even became a customer of the railway. The railway closures would become extremely political. The government was all for cutting services and lines, but was very reluctant to provide capital funds to invest in the services and renewals which Dr. Beeching wanted to make to improve the remaining parts of the network. The modernisation plan had been formulated back in 1955 and had committed £1.5 billion to be spent over the following 15 years. It still had 6 years to go, so the government didn't want to spend yet more money. But, a year after the report, at the height of the time when railway closures were being proposed or implemented, the Conservative government had to fight an election. They lost by a tiny margin. It seems likely that the plight of the railways was a decisive factor in that defeat, as the incoming Labour administration, heavily backed by the trades unions, had made an election pledge to look again at the Beeching plan. Perhaps the fact that the Conservative Transport Minister, Ernest Marples, was a major road contractor also helped swing the electorate. In the event, the figures in the plan were difficult to argue against, and the new government made very few changes to the proposals. Ironically, its trade union support was now largely from members in the road transport sector. The railway stood little chance of a major backtracking in policy. The report showed that half of British Railway's 7,000 stations produced just 2% of the total passenger traffic. 25% of traffic started at just 34 stations. 1/3 of the track carried just 1% of the traffic, and 1/2 didn't even carry sufficient traffic to cover its maintenance costs. Less than 1/3 of all carriages were in full-time use, many being reserved for summer or peak services only. The network of 18,000 miles of railway should be reduced by 1/3, which would be barely half of the total mileage of the system at its peak at the outbreak of the First World War, when there were 23,440 route miles. Routes needed at least 10,000 passengers a week just to break even, according to the report. The appendix to the report listed more than 2,000 stations and 250 train services which should be withdrawn on purely economic grounds. Closures couldn't be implemented immediately. Each closure had to be published and then considered by the Transport Users Consultative Committees as to whether withdrawal of passenger services would cause hardship to users. The doctor hoped 70% of his closures would be complete by the end of 1964, and all within 3 years. The advent of a Labour government merely slowed this a little, at first. Beeching produced a second report the following year, 1965, entitled The Development of the Major Railway Trunk Routes, in which he proposed even greater cuts, leaving vast swathes of the country such as Cornwall, East Anglia, Yorkshire and most of Scotland and Wales without rails. Just 3,000 miles would be developed and the total would shrink to 7,500 miles. It would involve even more investment, but was a step too far for the government and was rejected. Feeling rejected personally and realising he was out of step with the times, Dr. Richard Beeching, who had been seconded to British Railways by ICI, returned to that company in June 1965. Once it had decided that Beeching was right and ditching its election promises, the Labour government set to with a will to continue to implement the proposals. In fact, it sped them up. The railways had no friends in government, and this was merely confirmed when a snap election in 1966 returned Harold Wilson's party with a vastly increased majority. Railwaymen were on the back foot, and the railways were retrenching and contracting. Surprisingly, there were some odd survivals, such as the sand trains in rural Staffordshire, which would last for another 20 years or more. One little-known passage in the Beeching report hinted at an alternative way to view the loss-making lines. This was to treat those lines which the public recognised served a social need as a special case, and for some form of formal public subsidy to be set up. This would be taken up by the second Labour government, with Barbara Castle as Transport Secretary, and enacted in the 1968 Transport Act. This created the Passenger Transport Executives, PTEs, empowering local authorities in major cities to subsidise and invest in important routes. A system of public service obligation grants was set up to allow rural routes to remain open in the public interest, and this would be the foundation of all railway financing thereafter, as governments at last came to the conclusion that railways would never pay their way, but were an essential public service. Perhaps the best-known positive aspects and recommendations of the Beeching report were the proposals to introduce the very cost-effective merry-go-round coal trains and liner services. The merry-go-round principle involved further investment by two other nationalised industries besides the railways, the Central Electricity Generating Board, the CEGB, and the National Coal Board, NCB. Coordination of the three was seen as beneficial by the government, and the system was quickly implemented. The merry-go-round system consisted of a series of trains of dedicated coal hopper wagons running continuously from coal mine to power station non-stop. At the terminals, the trains would run under loading or unloading facilities at a steady slow speed, typically half a mile an hour, whilst the wagons would be loaded from or to hoppers, which would be connected directly to the pit or power station. British Railways had to provide the trains and tracks. The latter comprised balloon tracks at the terminals to obviate any need to turn or run round the trains. The trains themselves consisted of a new design of hopper wagon with a capacity of 33 tons, double the capacity of the traditional mineral wagons. The wagons were fitted with air brakes from new. To work the trains, a number of new diesel locomotives were fitted with special electronic control gear to enable them to run at the constant slow speed needed for the operation. In England, these were members of the new standard Type 4 diesels, at the time known as the Brush Type 4. They were a second-generation design, built and designed, at last, using the experience gained from the early pilot scheme and the subsequent panic order classes. They were to become the principal heavy freight engines of the 1960s and were used on the new traffic flows such as the merry-go-rounds and bulk freight flows such as this train of oil tanks, each of which could hold 100 tons of the black gold. These were the first taste of the wagons of the future, with continuous air brakes and running on bogies rather than the simple four-wheel chassis of older stock. As a result, they could run at express speeds. The locomotives first appeared in 1962. D1500 was released from Brush Engineering's Loughborough Works on the 28th of September that year and was the first of 512 locomotives built by 3 different builders. The class was used on all non-electrified lines around the country, the West Coast Main Line being the only one on which they were rarely seen. On that line, the wires were soon being erected on the lines south of Crewe to Euston, their ultimate goal. The Brush Type 4 wasn't the end of locomotive development by the enterprising manufacturer. In 1966, now part of the Hawker Siddeley Group, it started work on the most powerful diesel locomotive yet to have been seen on Britain's railways, the prototype 4,000 horsepower Kestrel. It was unveiled to the press at Marylebone Station.
London, just as perfect for those who want to sit around and go places at high speed. It's the Kestrel, the world's most powerful single-engine diesel-electric locomotive. Built by Hawker Siddeley as a private venture, it is thought that there'll be a big overseas market for the engine. British Rail are already very interested. Cruising speed is 110 miles an hour. Now to try it out. There's 4,000 horsepower tucked away inside the Kestrel, all of it taking the strain easily as she glides away from Marylebone Station on a demonstration run. With a few more like the Kestrel around, perhaps those timetables might come true.
New British Railways uniforms to herald new standards in passenger comfort. They call it the Train of Tomorrow. 8 specially built coaches, diesel-powered, and demonstrated for us during a run from London. Easier to get on and get off thanks to the wide folding doors, the train is going into service in different parts of the country, and passengers will be asked for their reactions. This is the second-class accommodation. Seats have been scientifically designed, while there's forced air heating and ventilation, special soundproofing, more civilized, easy-to-clean toilets. A smoother, quieter ride, big panoramic windows with blinds if you feel like a snooze, and partial double glazing too. In fact, it's British Railways' formula for attracting travellers back to trains. They're claimed to be among the best designed coaches in the world.
This Train of Tomorrow, again headed by a Brush locomotive, was the XP64, which was to launch the new look of British Railways. The new symbol, a double arrow, made its first appearance, and the coaches, although based on Mark I underframes, were built to test out proposed features for the second generation of standard coaches, the Mark IIs. This was the start of a complete overhaul of the railway's image to bring it into the modern era, and it was time to prepare the way for the completion of the flagship project of the modernisation plan, electric trains all the way to London Euston, itself completely remodelled for the new trains.
Euston Station, British Rail's gateway to the north and entrance to a new era of high-speed train travel. The London Midland region has gone electric, slashing the travelling time between London, Liverpool and Manchester to provide the fastest service in railway history between these cities. For driver Graham and his colleagues on the express routes, new electric locomotives capable of sustained high speeds will enable them to complete the journey between London and the northern cities in 2.5 hours. The overhead electrification system has cost £175 million. It is one of the most modern of its kind in the world, incorporating signal boxes with equipment that wouldn't look out of place at Cape Kennedy. Passenger comfort has also been given priority with new coaches, restaurant cars and sleeping accommodation rolling on continuous welded rail to give a smoother, more silent ride. From the driver's viewpoint, this is what it looks like up front at 100 miles an hour.
None of this razzmatazz could take away the importance of the other changes going on the railways. The largely unsung ancillary services were undergoing massive changes, many as a result of the Beeching report. Although to all appearances the traditional railway was to the fore, Beeching had recognised that the labour-intensive freight handling techniques had to change, and he identified the containerisation of freight traffic as the way ahead for the system. The railway would have no further need for the somewhat antiquated road vehicles with which it was saddled, as customers would present the containers at the railway's premises using their own transport. Containers would eliminate the form of loading seen here, as it would be done at the point of origin rather than on the railway. This is actually one of the new style containers being loaded for demonstration purposes. Beeching used the term liner trains for the proposed new container system. International dimensions and fixings had not yet been agreed for the actual containers, the most common of which were known as ISO containers. These were based on American practice and had standard height and width dimensions of 8 feet and lengths in multiples of 10 feet. These would present British Railways with some problems, as one of these units mounted on a normal British wagon would foul the British loading gauge, the maximum dimensions a vehicle could obtain without touching lineside features such as bridges and tunnels. But this could be overcome. Since this was a whole new concept, new vehicles and new facilities could be designed from the ground up, which is exactly what happened. A complete network of liner train terminals would be built at strategic locations around the country, in key cities and ports, to enable the containers to be transshipped as simply as possible. The terminals would handle ship-to-road traffic at the ports as well as ship-to-train. The new concept was then given an appropriate name, Freightliner. The special overhead cranes soon became a familiar sight at ports such as Southampton, Tilbury and Felixstowe, and manufacturing cities such as Leeds, Glasgow and Manchester. Road transport was as quick as the railway to adopt the concept, and for once, road and rail worked in harmony. After so many years of abstracting traffic from the railways, road transport now provided them with traffic. Beeching was right. Liner trains and container transport were the future. The first liner trains were ordered in 1964, and the Freightliner service was launched in 1965. Freightliner built special wagons for the new services, which had small wheels to allow for low floors and tall containers. Since the world market for containers was still very diverse, Freightliner produced its own version of the ISO standard, but not fully compliant, notably in the mounting points. Thus, the early Freightliner trains boasted containers displaying the Freightliner name. It would take some years for standardization to be applied, and to this day European containers differ from American ISO ones. The Freightliner containers were initially produced in 2 lengths, 20 foot and 27 foot. Height and width matched the ISO ones. In addition to the closed containers, some open types, which were more akin to large pallets, were produced. Their lives were short though, as users soon appreciated the security benefits of enclosed containers. Both the brush-type 4s and the new electric locomotives were allocated to the new trains, and the appearance of long trains with containers, all in an identical and very strikingly modern livery, was used to good effect by BR's publicity department. At last they had a state-of-the-art freight train and could banish the 19th century derived 4-wheel wagon load train to the lesser parts of the system. This was the first flowering of the fight back, which had been so long in coming. The first Freightliner train ran from London to Glasgow on the 15th of November 1965, exactly 1 week before the full electrified service from London to Crewe was inaugurated. The initial terminals were located with a view to inland domestic traffic. Freightliner had also invested in some road tractor units for these early services, and also encouraged a number of road haulage companies to acquire compatible units. Freightliner wasn't initially set up as an independent brand within the British Railways structure, but was what would later become known as a profit centre. Perhaps its most important factor was that it was a completely new concept, owing nothing to traditional working practices, despite the fact that containers had, as such, been in use on Britain's railways from the time of grouping. The Freightliner network was set up on the basis of a national railway system, ignoring all regional boundaries and traditions. In this it was unique. It symbolised the change in attitude from the old railway loyalties and looked forward. It was aggressive in its approach to acquiring traffic and used modern marketing methods to attain this. One oddity seen on these early Freightliner trains is the use of a passenger brake van. The issue of the elimination of the guard on a freight train was still being discussed with the unions, and thus a guard was still obligatory for Freightliner trains, although completely unnecessary. The trains were in effect built to passenger train standards and ran to passenger train speeds and to regular timetables. Not a first for Britain's railways, but certainly a new concept insofar as the entire network was concerned. The passenger brake vans had to be used as the traditional goods brake vans were unsuitable for high speed, and the redundancy of these vehicles in the Freightliner concept is evidenced by their use at the head of the train in many instances. Freightliner trains would be the first to eliminate them, the general process of taking them off all freight trains taking many years to come to fruition. Expansion of the network was spread over its first year of operations. The next service to be launched after the London to Glasgow one was from London to Manchester, starting in February 1966. Other services followed. London to Liverpool commenced in June. Services between the new centres were started in September between Liverpool and Glasgow, Manchester and Glasgow a week later, and from London to Aberdeen at the end of October. By the end of that year, around 27,000 loaded containers had been carried on the liner trains. Being launched concurrently with the completion of the electrification of the core part of the West Coast Main Line, the Freightliner concept was very much bound up in the attempts to relaunch the railway's image. In addition to these two achievements, the nationalised concern had been completely rebranded during 1965. At the beginning of the year, it had been renamed and would henceforth have the snappier title of British Rail rather than British Railways. This resulted in quite animated correspondence in the press for some while, which helped to emphasise that the railways were changing, and at last for the better. The rebranding took place while Dr. Beeching was still chairman, so much of the credit for its success should be laid at his door. All that remained to be completed in this first phase of West Coast electrification was the original London and Birmingham railway route through Birmingham from Rugby. One noticeable feature of the West Coast Main Line as it made its way northwards from London was the proximity of the Grand Union Canal. It was along this stretch that one of the most famous instances of theft in Great Britain took place when the Great Train Robbery was staged. Since the earliest days of railways, the Royal Mail had entrusted its precious cargo to the railway companies. A tradition had built up and was jealously guarded. An elaborate system for the transfer of mail on the move allowed trains to pick up or drop off mailbags without losing speed, and this was seen as a very important business source for the railways, so much so that it wasn't even questioned in the Beeching report. Mailbags were hung from special gantries at the side of the line at locations such as Penrith in Cumbria, which didn't merit a special stop. The process was considered to be quite alarming, and some post office staff would ask others to do the work for them. As the train approached the line-side apparatus, the staff inside the train would deploy nets from the side of the coach to collect the bags. Once the bags had been captured, the coach side could be sealed and the bags moved inside the train to the sorting areas. Known as the Travelling Post Office, or TPO, the trains were equipped with special vehicles to effect the transfer and a series of sorting vans in which post office staff could sort the mail whilst on the move. Inside the vans were rows of sorting boxes which were similar to those used in normal, static post offices. An elaborate network of trains ran every night, making connections at intermediate junctions, and the mail had to be sorted as expeditiously as possible to be ready for transfer at these locations. Working throughout the night, the men of the TPO were a special breed. A great sense of pride in the job meant that many would work on these services throughout their working lives. Like all post office staff, they worked for the post office and not the railway. They knew the geography of the country intimately. The letters and packages handled on the trains had already been pre-sorted into local and national mail at the collecting offices, and the on-train staff's job was to resort the latter into receiving areas. A further sort would be required at the receiving centres and a final sort at the delivery offices. Intermediate sorts on the trains would be made to effect transfers at the major hubs, such as Crewe, where we see the Scottish TPO calling in the middle of the night. There were three types of dedicated TPO vehicle. The most unusual were the vans which collected the mails, with their collecting nets and apparatus. Joined to these via offset corridor connectors, which were fitted so that the vans could only be used with one another, were the sorting vans, in which the work was done. Some of these had mailboxes in the side, which meant that members of the public could post their mail directly into the train for an additional fee. The final type of van was the stowage van, in which the bags to be sorted and the bags which had been sorted were kept. These would be the vans from which the nighttime exchanges at intermediate stations took place. The trains ran to a tight timetable, and the schedules, whilst not publicised, could be easily obtained by those who wanted to know where the trains would be and when. Amongst those who wanted to know was a gang of London criminals. The night mail was known to carry valuable registered mail, including a large amount of cash, which was sorted in a specific sorting van known as a high-value package van. On the night of 7th of August 1963, the up TPO from Glasgow to London had an unusually large amount of these packages containing cash, as there had just been a bank holiday in Scotland. One of the gang had spent some months befriending TPO and railway staff, and thus knew that this would be the particular train to rob. The usual value of the packages was in the region of £300,000, but on this occasion it was £2.3 million, which equates to 30 million today. The robbers stopped the train by tampering with a signal to make the driver, Jack Mills, apply the brakes. Boarding the train, they forced him to drive it further towards London to an overbridge, where they had vans and cars waiting. The press had a field day, making folk heroes of the robbers, even though they had ruined the life of driver Jack Mills as they coshed him during the robbery, contributing to his early death in 1970. On a lighter note, we can now examine other ways in which the new British Rail tried to make money from its erstwhile rival, the motor car. Motor rail was the name coined in 1966 to publicise the expansion of a service which had been offered from 1955 on the London to Perth route. The expansion centred on a new terminal at Kensington Olympia, from which a number of new services were to start to places such as Penzance, Plymouth, Carlisle, Glasgow and Inverness. Although it was expensive to use, there was something to be said about taking your car on the train in the 1960s, the era of massive traffic jams before the construction of much of the motorway network.
You'll want the car when you're in Scotland, Cornwall or North Wales, but why not avoid the strain of a long drive by putting it on the train and relaxing in comfort till you get there? Kensington Olympia is the first motor rail terminal in the world. This particular station was chosen for the purpose because it connects with all rail arteries. The Cartic double-decker truck is not too high for mainline bridges or tunnels. When British Rail have enough of them, they will replace the car single-decker. It's been possible to put the car on the train for some years past, but these are the first trains exclusively for the purpose in Britain, operating from their own terminal. On a demonstration run to Newbury, car owners sampled luxury travel in the comfortable knowledge that their auto would be with them at the destination. What a contrast, these summertime traffic jams. They get worse every year. The motor rail will help to relieve them. Not so long ago, the motorist used to congratulate himself on being independent of trains and timetables. Road congestion has made him think again. Getting the car off the train is as quick and easy as putting it on. It looks a great idea.
The Beeching plan for closing hundreds of miles of unprofitable railway lines has given inventors plenty of food for thought. One bright idea is the railmobile, an invention which allows the motorist to drive his car along the railway lines. The car's rear wheels transfer the power through rollers to the trolley. Incredible to think that a baby car can drive a trolley weighing 1.5 tons, fired, here we go. It's effortless motoring, all right, and it opens up endless possibilities for getting about the country. 60 miles an hour on the clock gives an actual trolley speed around 30. And if this car's gone loco, then here's one that's plainly right round the bend.
Seeing this chap on a bike is almost prophetic. Railways cut by Beeching's axe would one day become cycle tracks across the country, as people would seek ways to travel without damaging the environment. But before that, the tracks and Britain's beloved steam engines would have to go.